Today is Friday, October 22nd, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. And while I'm out on a walk this evening, I'd like to talk about a topic that is obviously very important in modern educational circles, and one that I get asked about by parents quite a bit in the academy, and it's the question of ADHD, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, ADHD. When I was a kid, it was referred to as ADD, Attention Deficit Disorder, and I'm not sure if they've simply added to that condition the hyperactivity or if it's actually a distinct disorder. But whether we're talking about ADD or ADHD, it's strange to me when we speak of a disorder, when it becomes apparent that more and more of the students are diagnosed, whether formally or informally, with a disorder. There should be a norm, and the norm should refer to 70-80% of the population, and then disorders should be rare. After all, if they're not rare, then they must just be natural and normal. But we label them as a disorder because there's an assumption that they're not normal. And therefore, when we see a condition that's labeled a disorder multiplying and being assigned to more and more children, we have to stop and ask, what exactly is going on here? And in this talk, I'd like to get into this a little bit, try to make some sense out of it, not as any kind of physician or psychologist, but as a teacher, as one who studies ancient philosophy and Catholic theology, one who is responsible for the parenting of 10 children, who's worked in education for over 20 years now, full time. I think I can contribute some practically helpful insights into this whole question of ADHD, and leave parents and students encouraged, because I don't believe that there's some kind of outbreak of disorders among human beings. I don't believe that God is screwing up the creation process and producing all kinds of rejects and defects. It's much more likely that the systems of modern society, the institutions that we create artificially, the policies and procedures that we establish as human beings, are the cause of the problem, or the apparent problem, and not nature itself. So first of all, what is this condition that we talk about when we talk about ADHD? And obviously, the name of the condition leaves it as no mystery that we're talking about a behavioral disorder. And let's just limit this discussion to children, since this is an educational context. But we're talking about kids who in their setting have a problem with paying attention to the activities that they're engaged in. They're hyperactive. That is, their behavior doesn't seem appropriate in terms of their activity level. It seems that they have too much energy for the activities that are being assigned to them. And so they have this attention deficit where they're not capable of paying attention to the degree that's being required of them. Notice that these are not objective or absolute terms. These are relative terms that assume that there's some kind of normal. But we'll see that we don't get a definition of the normal. And that's what makes these issues so confusing. It seems that everybody has attention deficit to some degree. I'm able to sit and study as a classical schoolmaster for 18, 20 hours a day. And I might say, well, obviously I don't have an attention deficit problem. But if someone comes into my office and starts talking to me about what's going on in politics, you won't keep my attention for 5 minutes. And there's no question that if the topic is politics, modern party politics, I have severe attention deficit disorder. I can't pay attention to that stuff. If you want to engage in small talk and just chit-chat again, I'm not going to be there mentally. But if you want to get into a discussion about Christian philosophy or education, I can talk through the night and go without sleep, without taking a break. So what then is attention deficit disorder? Is it just a simple lack of interest? And if that's the case, if it's a simple lack of interest, is that necessarily a disorder? Or is that just natural? Now, the reason why I ask this is because if we study the Baltimore Catechism, the lesson that covers the question of vocations, we learn that there are two factors in determining a person's vocation. The first is aptitude, which means ability. Is the student able to do what a particular vocation requires? And the lesson explains this very clearly and practically. For example, if the priestly ministry requires years and years of study and places all kinds of intellectual demands on an individual, if a student has no aptitude for study or counseling or teaching, that lack of aptitude in this specific area suggests that he does not have a vocation to the priestly ministry. If a boy says that he wants to be a carpenter and he wants to devote his whole life to carpentry, and yet he's sickly and can't do physical work, his lack of aptitude or actual ability to do the work required by that vocation suggests that he is wrong about what he should do. And we always discuss these topics within the context of God's providence and God's will for our lives. The idea of a vocation is not the same as an occupation. The idea of an occupation is something that someone does. And it's understood that a man chooses his occupation, prepares for his occupation, and then works in that occupation. And his success in the occupation is judged by whether or not he's able to turn a profit through that occupation, or whether he's able to accomplish his end through that occupation. Vocation has a different sense. The word itself, vocation, is derived from the Latin verb vocare, which means to call. And the idea is that within the Christian understanding of life and work, men don't merely choose their own occupation in life. Men don't merely go and do what they want to do in their lives, if they want to be happy at least. Men should seek to examine themselves and discern how they can serve God in the best way possible. And as always, God doesn't leave his service or worship to man to figure out. He reveals to us how we can and should serve and worship him. And he does this in our lives providentially and reveals to us his will, which we call our vocation, the work of this life to which we are called. That's what the word vocation means. And so, for a worldly, ungodly man to talk about his occupation, even the way we phrase these questions with kids when they're young, we say, "Hey, Tommy, what do you want to do when you get older?" And you can see just how inappropriate it is to phrase the question with those words. What do you want to do? As if Tommy here formed himself out of the dust of the earth, breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and now is free to decide what he would like to do with this body and soul that he created. The purpose of our life is to fulfill the will of God in our particular circumstances. And discerning what that will is what it means to discern a vocation. Not to ask, what do I want to do with my life? But to ask, what does God want me to do with my life? Or how can I serve God in the best way possible? And that's the idea of a vocation. It always has a religious context or sense, because there has to be a caller, one who calls, for there to be a vocation. Now, in modern society, man has decided. And when I say man has decided, if we identify who the actual men were who made these decisions, we'll find that secular, materialistic men decided that it would be good, according to their own purposes, to make education compulsory for all American children. And so laws were passed that made education compulsory. So every American child between the ages of 7 and 16 or 17, and the details of these laws vary from state to state, but it's been decided by the government, by the people whom these government officials, these legislators represent. It's been decided that American children will be required to attend school full time for 180 days of the year throughout their entire childhood. They'll spend the bulk of their youth in school. That idea developed in the early 1900s. It was never practiced in the medieval world. It was never practiced before the founding of the United States of America. It was never practiced in the kingdoms of Europe or the ancient world. It's a brand new idea that emerged from a couple of modern social movements that made it necessary. The first was the advent of democratic government for common people to be able to participate in the governing process, in the political process. There had to be at least some training for children growing up to adult citizens to understand the system of government and to be able to participate in it. They needed to have a democratic education. And if I'm not mistaken, John Dewey, back in the early 1900s, actually wrote a book titled Democracy and Education, which presented the modern naturalistic philosophical principles that guided the development of the modern compulsory schools. And then in addition to that, there was the influence of the industrialization of our society, where we moved away from local self-sufficient communities and individual skilled craftsmen with apprentices, where locally the entire manufacturing process was completed. And we moved from that ancient model of economy to the modern industrial model, which has to do with mass production, the division of labor, the construction of products from movable parts, where men could specialize in very small parts of the production or manufacturing process, and the jobs or the professions that were available to men radically changed. A man didn't have to become a craftsman to make a living. He simply had to do a job on an assembly line. He basically had to serve as a prototype for the future machine that would replace him. In the generation when these ideas developed, there was no technology to do the work, and so men were used like robots to perform specific functions, specific repeated functions. That was their job. As technology developed in recent times, we see that now man fell for a trap that now makes him disposable because his simple, specialized task can be assigned to a machine or a piece of software. But the ancient idea of work was that a man studied and trained through apprenticeship to become a complete, self-reliant master of a craft. And once he became master of that craft, he could go anywhere that such a craftsman was needed, set up shop, and live happily ever after. But in the industrial era, we had the combination of democratic government and industrialized, I should say specialized labor. And the school was seen as the place where the future participants in this new world order would be trained and programmed and developed. And it was understood that this education should be the focus of every child's life between the ages of 6 and 16 or 17 years of age. So now we take this entire human population between the ages of 6 and 17, we pull them out of the fields, we pull them out of the streets, we pull them out of the warehouses, we pull them out of the homes, pull them out of the gardens, out of the workshops, and we put them all into school. And there they sit in their desks at school. And as we look at this classroom or school full of children, we see children intended within God's will for all different vocations. But we see them rounded up, as it were, and made subject to this new man-made world order. And there they sit, either all standing in line or seated rank and file in their classroom, all dressed in their school uniforms, all subject to the same school curriculum. All of their differences are ignored, and they're classified not by height or weight, not by their parents' professions, not by their race, not by their family histories, not by the businesses that their families have worked in, not by the different vocations of their parents and grandparents and relatives. They're organized in this modern, democratic, industrialized school system by one characteristic. One characteristic orders and sorts the students, and that one characteristic is date of birth. If you're 7 years old, you're in second grade. If you're 9 years old, you're in the fourth grade. If you're 15 years old, you'll be in the 10th grade The students are sorted in one uniform curriculum according to their date of birth. And the grade school system is established at the service not of any Christian philosophy, not of any Catholic worldview, not in the service of the gospel or the Great Commission, but in the service of this naturalistic modern worldview that has two things in mind: the role of the citizen in a democratic society and the role of an individual in the modern industrialized workforce. And every individual has his identity established by his place in this school, in this modern context. Now, as we've gathered all of these different children from all of these different backgrounds, all of these different families, different physical qualities, different mental qualities, different family cultural interests and activities, and have put them all together in a classroom. We have to define in this classroom what the normal behavior will be. And as we look around at this classroom, we see Michael Jones over here, who comes in the morning, very neatly dressed, always clean, hair combed, teeth brushed, freshly bathed, healthy, and he stands quietly in line, follows the teacher's instructions, sits down in his desks, does what he's assigned, and is perfectly content with the life of the schoolboy. At the end of the school day, he packs up his books, heads home, spreads his books out on the dining room table where his family gathers in the evening. The mother helps him with his homework. His siblings work on their studies, and at 9 o'clock they close up for the night, wrap up and go to bed. And he is defined and identified as the model schoolboy. But when we look at that same classroom, we look a couple rows over and we find another kid. We find Billy Michael. That's me when I was a kid growing up. We find Billy Michael. That's the name that I went by when I was in school. And Billy comes from a family where his entire family of male relations, all of the men in his life, are physical, working, mechanical men. His father is an electrical contractor. His grandfather is an engine builder. His uncle is a welder. His other uncle, a mechanic. At Billy's house, a quarter of the house is a garage. And in the garage, there are work vehicles. There's machinery being repaired. There are race cars. Shelves and shelves of tools and mechanical supplies and equipment. There are no books in Billy's house. No one has ever been to college. No one talks about school in Billy's house. When they need a break from work, they play sports. And at 7 o'clock in the morning, Billy has to get up and go to school. He's got to leave this active, busy, working family behind, dressed in his school clothes, and he's got to go stand in line and sit in his desk. And he hates it. He has nothing in common with a teacher or any of his teachers. He finds sitting down intolerable. He'd like to stand up. He'd like to walk around. He'd like to kneel on his chair. He'd like to be able to move. He's not used to this sedentary behavior, especially for 5 or 6 hours. And he just doesn't understand what's going on. He doesn't understand what the teacher's talking about. All the topics are topics that his family never discusses at home, and all of the stuff his family does at home and all the topics they talk about have nothing to do with daily life or activity in the school. The only class that he's good at is gym class. And whenever he talks about the kinds of things that his family talks about at home, the teacher yells at him to be quiet and get back to work and pay attention. But Billy doesn't understand what any of this is for, and his mind is in a different place. He is paying attention to something. He's paying attention to the life that he lives at home, the life that he knows. What he has a hard time paying attention to is this life of the teacher, and this life of a few of the kids in his classes. But Billy actually finds that most of the kids are like him. Most of the kids don't want to talk about the stuff they talk about at school. Most of the kids want to talk about baseball and football and basketball and race cars. Most of the kids want to hang out on the weekends and see what Billy's family is doing in the garage, or go to the races with Billy's family. The stuff that Billy's family does is interesting to a lot of boys. There's always work to do. Kids come over and they all help out in the cars. They help out in the garage, and there's lots of work to do, and the kids like doing that work. They like building stuff. They like working on bikes and cars and dirt bikes. That stuff's interesting. It's useful. We drive around in cars every day. We live in houses that need to be built and maintained and improved. It seems like all the stuff that Billy knows how to do is useful until he goes to school. And there at school, Billy's judged for how fast he can multiply. He's judged for how neatly he can write in cursive letters. He's judged for how well he can follow the teacher's instructions, how quietly he can sit in his desk. And Billy doesn't get good grades in this school, and his teacher criticizes him and complains, and he's labeled as having an inability to pay attention. And I believe that this is the context in which this disorder exists. But the truth is, this kid has no problem paying attention. He has no natural problem with an attention deficit. He's simply not interested in what's being done at this modern, man-made, compulsory school. And he's yelled at and punished and graded and criticized through his entire childhood until he's finally 18 years old, receives his diploma, and never has to set foot in that school again. Never has to talk about those topics again. Never has to read those books again. Never has to see those teachers again. And can go to work with his family, thinking about, talking about, focusing on, working on all of the things that got him penalized while he was in school. If he chooses to go to college, his elementary school and his high school are not going to pay his college tuition. His college tuition is going to be paid for by the carpenters and mechanics in his family. Their work is going to pay for his college studies if he chooses to go to college. And if he starts a business and needs to borrow some money to help get a business off the ground, that money is not going to come from the public school system that judged and graded him and labeled him as having no ability to pay attention. His financial support, when he gets established on his own 2 feet, is going to come from the carpenters and electricians and mechanics that he grew up with. Every aspect of his life is going to be directly affected by his family. And he's been subjected to this decade-long artificial life, criticized, judged, graded, labeled, and so on, that in a moment pops like a bubble and disappears. And yet in that context, we ask if a certain child is disordered because he appears to have an inability to pay attention. He has an attention deficit. We're not allowed to question the artificial, man-made school culture. We're not allowed to question the content of the curriculum. We have to treat the modern school, the modern curriculum, the modern worldview, we have to treat it as if it is as timeless and human and natural as the trees and flowers and birds outside the classroom window. And the child thinks of himself in terms of the grades and the criticism he receives while he's inside this school system, as if he's being judged by nature itself and being labeled as some kind of defect, when there's absolutely nothing wrong with this boy, as his future life proves. He's unable to pay attention as the teacher would like him to do. He's unable to pay attention as the principal of the school would like him to do. He's unable to pay attention to the content of this curriculum that's been designed and made compulsory by other people. which again would be fine if it was the true controlling influence of his future life, but it's not. It's an entirely temporary and artificial obstacle course that once completed becomes completely irrelevant. And the testimony of almost every kid who finishes with that school experience says, I had no idea what I was doing when I was in school. He's also criticized because he's said to be hyperactive. And by hyperactive, we mean he's too active, too much physical energy. He's being asked to stand in line and wait his turn at the water fountain. He's asked to sit in his desk for 45 minutes and be quiet. He's asked to sit on the floor and play with some blocks or sit in a small chair and read a book. And if we find that this boy has more energy, more capacity for work and activity than these artificial indoor activities require, he's suspected of having a disorder and is labeled as being hyperactive. He gets yelled at by his teacher because he doesn't play quietly. He gets yelled at by his teacher because he can't stand still. He gets yelled at by his teacher because he doesn't like sitting with his feet on the floor in front of him for 40 minutes. And he's yelled at and criticized and penalized by his teachers, and he is told that he has a disorder, that there is something wrong with him, that he is a defect, a human being that isn't normal. He is told that his energy and activity is excessive and disordered. Disordered. This word disordered is significant. If we find a man who is watching pornography, we say that his interest in sexual things is disordered. What it means is it's unnatural. It's contrary to nature, or it exceeds the bounds of nature. It goes beyond what is good for man according to God's will. We say that a man is disordered in his affections if he's gluttonous. He eats more than is healthy. He's disordered. And these labels, when we label a man disordered, we mean that there is something truly wrong with him as a human being. His behavior is not what human behavior is intended by the Creator to be. His behavior is harmful to his life. His behavior is an obstacle to his duties in life. That's what it means for behavior to be disordered. And yet, this boy in this artificial school system is told that his inability to stay focused on his teacher's lecture in algebra class is a disorder. His inability to sit still and be quiet all day is a disorder. And we can see what the real nature of this problem is. Now, if you've listened this far, you're probably saying, yeah, the school system is the problem. The school system is the problem. All of this schooling and this modern curriculum and this modern educational system, that's the actual problem. But you're only partially right. There's another problem here. And the problem is that adults have oversimplified to the point of speaking falsely about the reality of compulsory education. Let me repeat that. Adults have oversimplified the real situation in America and have caused compulsory education to appear to be something that it's not. It's absolutely true. God's will is not served by the modern, democratic, industrial, revolution era public school system. God's will for man is not served by that school system. But here's the important thing to note. No one in America is actually required to subject his children to that system. Compulsory education only refers to the legal requirement that a certain minimum education be provided to every American citizen. Compulsory education does not say that a student must attend the government school. Compulsory education does not put a kid in one of those seats. Compulsory education does not make any individual child stand in line in that hallway at that water fountain. The parents of that child choose to put him in that school. And by not providing him with an alternative form of education, then the compulsory education laws require that boy to go to that school. That boy's presence in that school is not owed to the laws of compulsory education in America. That boy's presence in that school is owed to the fact that his parents do not provide an alternative to it. Not providing an alternative requires that that boy be in that school. And so it's not fair or true to blame that boy's experience on that school or on the compulsory education laws in the United States of America. The parents choose to send that boy to that school. Now you may say, well, what can the parents do? They can't necessarily... Well, if that's true, that the parents cannot provide an alternative, then they cannot complain. And if the parents do want to complain and say that God's will is not served by that school, or if those parents want to complain that that school program is not good for the child, then that raises the pressure and turns up the heat on those parents for why they do not prepare an alternative. If it's so serious, if it's so dangerous, then you should do something about it. And if you don't do something about it, then you're just full of baloney. The compulsory laws for education in the United States only affect a child when his parents do not provide him with a better alternative. You have to be in a pretty low place to have compulsory laws knocking on your door and giving you a hard time about your children's education. And that's not on the schools. That's not dictatorship. That's the parents' fault. Let me give an illustration. Imagine if you were a Christian parent and you believe that Christian life should be simple. Christians should not be materialistic. Christians shouldn't be worried about name brands or what the latest trends in clothing are. Shouldn't be worried about the fashions and customs of some modern secular society. And so you clothe your children in what you consider to be proper Christian apparel. Some simple, comfortable, functional clothes, a good pair of durable shoes, and you say that's good Christian clothing. Our clothing serves a purpose. We don't strut around like peacocks showing off our logos and name brands. We dress ourselves for functionality, to keep warm, to keep dry, to be able to work, to stay safe. Our clothing is functional. Our clothing is in harmony with Christian principles of dress and modesty and clothing. But then you turn around and enroll that child in a secular public school where those things do matter among the student body in that school. The brand names do matter in those circles. The kids do care about what kind of shoes you wear, what kind of shirt you wear, where you get your clothes. And you know that as a parent. You know that those things are important in secular society. And you enroll your child in that school and push him out of the car in the morning, dressed according to your Christian principles, to go and live in the secular school. And that child begins to get made fun of and criticized. Kids are pointing at his shoes. What are those? Kids are looking at his clothes, asking him, what are you, an Amish person? Where'd you get your dress? Israel? And the kid gets picked on throughout the day. Are you going to turn around as the parent and complain about the whole school for doing what you already know they do? Or are you going to ask yourself, what the heck is my kid doing in that school? Is the kid supposed to bear the brunt of the pressure of the world so that you can avoid the difficulty and sacrifice of providing a better alternative? Is that the kid's mission in this life, or is that your mission in this life? And so I don't blame the school. I don't blame the school psychologists and counselors. I don't blame the school teachers for saying this boy in this context has a disorder. I don't blame the teachers because They're there because that's their system. I don't blame the teachers. I don't blame the counselors. They're running their system. They have their philosophy. They have their religion. They have their standards and curriculum and culture and ideas about what life should be like. Your kids don't belong in that context. And if you put them into that context, they're going to be labeled according to how they compare to the other kids and standards in that context. Is the school right in establishing those standards? No. Are those standards true and real within God's will? No. Is the school even designed to really lead children to success in life? No. But that's a separate issue. Your child's presence in that school is your decision. The school bus doesn't pull up and drag kids out of houses. Enrollment is compulsory when you don't provide a better alternative. And as a Christian parent, how can you complain about that? How can you complain when you fail to prepare a better alternative? And so there are two parties to blame in these situations. First of all, the schools being established and created by their own false philosophies, their own materialistic worldview. And secondly, the Christian parents who in all their getting, in all their activity, neglect to prepare an education for their children according to Christian standards, to serve God. So there are two parties to blame. And there's no explanation for why these topics are even in the mouths of Christian people. I will never talk about one of my children as having a learning disability because my children are in a context where they belong, living in their own family, developing their own unique abilities and interests, and moving to adulthood where they're allowed, as individuals, to choose their own states of life and occupations. I don't run them all through the cookie cutter and try to make carbon copies of myself because my children are not responsible to be me. For example, right now, I'm out for a walk talking about educational and philosophical topics while my kids, my boys, are out in the woods playing war. You could probably hear them in the background. My 3 eldest children have joined the military. I have absolutely zero interest in the military. But my vocation is not my children's vocation. My responsibility as a parent is to raise my children to know God's will, to know God's commandments, and to provide discipline that they need during their youth, and then to assist them as they seek to discern and pursue their own individual vocation in their own independent adult lives. I don't ask my son, Samuel, who would like to go into the military and loves outdoor, physical, active work and is good at it, I don't ask him to sit and study mathematics for 8 hours a day. I don't ask him to sit next to me while I study and work for 18 hours a day, doing my life's vocation, and then label him as disordered because he can't hang with me while I talk about philosophy. My children would have an attention deficit if they were forced to live my vocation, because it's not their vocation. And while the one characteristic of a vocation in a person's life is said to be aptitude, the other is interest. The second qualification by which a person discerns a vocation is interest. Aptitude and interest. And isn't it interesting that attention relates to interest? And therefore, when we find a kid not willing to pay attention to an issue, it reveals his lack of interest in that thing, and that's part of the means by which his vocation in life is discerned, his aptitude and his interest. And when someone is not interested in what you or I am interested in, that doesn't mean that he has something wrong with him or that he's a defect and needs to be labeled and drugged for a disorder. It more likely means we're not putting that kid in position in life where he can be successful. And it may upset a parent who's decided that he is going to be an intellectual to have a son that wants nothing to do with intellectual activity, but that kid is not a robot for him to program and play with in life, and he has no authority to tell that child what to do with his adult life. And it's much wiser for a parent, when he sees these things in a child, to learn from them as a Christian himself and ask, what is the Lord revealing to be His will in this child's life, rather than trying to punish and beat and press that kid into some mold that he is making himself, and in so doing is committing the same error that the modern philosophers created who gave us this modern compulsory education system. Our children are not our servants. Our children are not mini-me's. They're not free employees. They're not our heirs to take over our businesses and fulfill our desires in life. Our children are given to us temporarily, according to the flesh, and we're to provide for their bodies and souls during their youth. But when they enter adulthood, they have the freedom to choose for themselves their state of life, their marriage partner if they wish to get married, and their occupation. And that's none of our business. We can assist them if they seek our advice. The Catechism teaches us that we should be ready to offer judicious, experienced advice to help them, but they're free to choose their own adventure in this life, just as we were free when we became adults to choose ours. If we put our children in unnatural circumstances that conflict with their own individual qualities and characteristics, we're going to find that they don't thrive. Just like if we put a plant in the wrong spot in the house, or in a wrong part of the garden, or plant something at the wrong time of the year, it won't thrive. We don't blame the plant when that happens. We don't say, this tomato plant is retarded. It doesn't grow. We say, Why are you putting a tomato plant out in the middle of February? What's disordered in that situation is not the tomato plant, which is acting according to its nature. What's disordered is the gardener who's got the plant in a place it doesn't belong. And as parents, this is the skill of parenting. Like the skill of the gardener. God gives us these little sprouting plants, and it's our job not to impose order upon them according to our will, but to discover the order that already exists within them and to cultivate it. Just as Adam was created and he was told to tend the ground and keep it, not to create something that he wills, but he was to observe the order that already exists in nature and to help it along by his work. When we understand nature, our work in keeping it is relatively light work. And that's the work that God asks man to do. The work of parenting is relatively light work. God doesn't ask us to create saints as if that's within our power. And parents torment themselves by these ridiculous ideas about what their children should be, what their children should look like, what their family should look like, what their house should look like. And they pretend that anyone who doesn't conform is some kind of defect or depraved, evil prodigal. The problem isn't the plant. The problem is the gardener. The problem is the whole set of circumstances that are out of order because we're not focused on the actual goal of parenting and education, which is to enable each individual plant to thrive according to its own characteristics. To help the tomato plant understand what it means to be a tomato plant, and to help a watermelon plant to understand what it means to be a watermelon plant, to help a blueberry bush understand what it means to be a blueberry bush. That you can't be with the tomatoes if you're designed to grow blueberries. And as parents, that's the work of parenting. In education, that's the work of a teacher. If you give me an extraordinarily gifted, academic, driven student who's called to intellectual work, I'll be able to help that student thrive by challenging him to go with me in my studies, because he's going to have a life that in different ways resembles mine. If you give me a child who's destined for a life of mechanical work, my job as a schoolmaster, as a wise teacher, is to help you as a parent and him as a student discern that, understand that, and best prepare for it. Not to try to turn him into a St. Thomas Aquinas. And as parents, much of this problem in modern society with learning disabilities and these disorder labels and things like that, we're so arrogant to pretend that everything we're doing is right and any child who sticks out of order is wrong. That we literally believe that when a child doesn't thrive according to the way we like to do things, that he is a defect. And that's just crazy modern arrogance. Rather than sitting before God and asking, what is the purpose that you have for this child, and how can I, as his temporary caretaker, nurture him and cultivate virtues and knowledge and experience that will help him best prepare for that vocation. That's the work of a parent. And that's the role of education. And when we fix these things, we'll find that we don't have kids with attention deficit disorder. We'll find that we don't have problems with hyperactivity because the kids are put in places and engaged in activities that are proper to their abilities and interests. So that's a lot to think about. I'm going to wrap up this talk because it's already over an hour. You can hear the sounds of the battle cries and warfares over in the background, which means it's dinner time here. So I hope that's a helpful talk on these issues. And I'd like to challenge you to think differently about them. I'd like you to give your kids a chance before you label them and buy into the ideas that an artificial system of education creates and assigns to kids who may be doing nothing wrong at all. God bless.